This lecture is on the 1960s, basically what's going on in the 60s, and also the idea of emerging feminism, because there's definitely going to be this wave of feminism in the 60s that's definitely going to be there, 60s and into the 70s. I kind of say, yeah, and then it kind of changes in the 80s. It's definitely feminism's still there, just different. But when you talk about the 60s, women of the 1960s, attitudes were definitely changing in various communities and across the across the country. And what's happening in the 60s is definitely a time of liberalism, and people who normally don't speak out, or in a sense feel like they don't have a voice, will actually speak out in the 60s. And you'll have a lot of groups, various groups that will speak out in the 60s, and one of those groups will be women. But in the 1960s, you have a lot of ethnicity communities that will speak out. African American, Hispanic communities will speak out. College students will speak out. But also another group that will speak out is women. It's people really who hadn't had a voice in the past, or felt like they didn't have a voice in the past, will speak out in the 60s. Okay, so when you talk about women, and going back to the women in the 1960s, thoughts about fears of disrupting the household if women spoke out or did something are starting to dissipate a little bit. And so I think women are feeling a little bit more comfortable about speaking out, that just because they want to speak out or do something differently doesn't necessarily mean that that means the family's going to fall apart. And you definitely will get some people within society that will definitely encourage women to work and to do things that they want to do. In 1961, you're going to have President Kennedy. He's actually going to have a commission on the status of women. That is 1961. Eleanor Roosevelt will be appointed chairperson. And in this Commission on the Status of Women, 1961, they're actually going to create a 66-page report about what they see when they talk, when they've talked to women, done research about women in the country. And some of the things that they talk about will be improved access to education for all women, aid for women, and also aid for child care services for working women. Equal employment opportunities, wider roles for women in the government, and equality of rights under the law. Okay, the commission, in a sense, doesn't radically change anything in the United States, but what it really will do is initiate a national debate on women's issues, and it really kind of raises the question or questions about women's role in society. And it really gets basically people talking and women feeling comfortable to talk, and also about potentially pushing the envelope for where they are in life. Now, you will get what's known as the 1963 Equal Pay Act, and many people will see this as a major feat, if you will. So the Equal Pay Act 1963 is the first major piece of legislation concerning women's employment since the Progressive era. And basically it said equal pay for equal work. Now, I know, I mean, when you first think, you think, wow, that's great, but it doesn't actually equate that way. The outcomes were actually not the greatest, okay? The government had to enforce the law. They have a law in the books, but it doesn't mean that the government's going to enforce the law. And it doesn't always happen. And then also, the law did not apply to women who performed specialized work, as in women's work. And if you worked doing women's work, then you got less pay. And so it actually didn't translate to women getting equal pay. Another thing is that it doesn't cover basically women who are working like labor jobs. So once again, it doesn't really pan out. And then another thing is that it's a law on the books, but women have to press the issue, because the thing is that there's a lot of employers that don't want to do it. And so they won't do it. And then for women to get equal pay, they basically have to argue it, they have to fight it. And women aren't quite there yet. They're like, well, I'd rather have a job and get paid than to lose my job because I'm fighting for equal pay. And so you don't always see women press the issue. And so a lot actually doesn't change, even though you have the Equal Pay Act of 1963. And then also remember, it does not apply to specialized women's work, which would automatically be at a lesser wage. Okay, another thing that is going to happen or will occur is in 1966, you're going to have affirmative action. Now, affirmative action was created by President Johnson, and it is actually created in response to the Watts riot in Los Angeles. And it's actually, in a sense, it's written for the African American, but the way that it's worded is that it's basically minority groups, and women will say we're a minority group, and so they'll take advantage of it. So this piece of legislation prohibited racial discrimination, mandating that the hiring of ethnic groups, people of color ethnic groups, minority groups, I'm sorry. The legislation prohibited racial discrimination, mandating the hiring of minority groups, which include people of color, and it would also grant them access to education. And they can't be denied education. So basically, a state college or a state school would actually be paid if they basically brought in minority groups. And also, it would encourage employers to hire people of minority groups. Now, once again, it's written in response to the Watts riot, and it's a way to try and help the African American community who's living in poverty. But women will say, well, we're a minority group, and so they will actually use it. They will use affirmative action to basically get into universities. They'll use it to get into graduate programs and also use it for hiring purposes. And it actually works well and does well for women. Okay, another thing that will also be created is the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, and those are to enforce the regulations. Once again, doesn't always enforce the regulations. It's a little bit of a hit and miss. And you really need the individual to really press the issue. Okay, so now moving away from legislation that would affect women, you have this feminism that's going on in the 60s, and there's definitely going to be a backlash to it. Your conservatives are really going to kind of want to put the brakes on it, and there will be that backlash. And so from that backlash, what the conservative population will say, and it's men and women, okay, they'll say that the American family would suffer and that women should remain domestic and maternal. It would lead to more divorces and the breakdown of the family. Now, two women that are going to kind of spearhead this backlash to feminism and argument to feminism is going to be a woman by the name of Phyllis Schlafly. Phyllis Schlafly is going to be probably the biggest voice against feminism, but she'll also have Maribel Morgan that will also be working with her. But Phyllis Schlafly tends to be the kind of the face, and you'll hear her a lot. And they will run extensive campaigns to get women back into the home. One argument, it says that the growth of the displaced homemaker, the women without sellable job skills who were divorced would be unable to support themselves. So they're basically saying that it's if you get a divorce and you pushing in the envelopes that women wouldn't be able to take care of themselves and put themselves into poverty. Anyway, it's a response to that backlash to feminism. It's a hard one. It's kind of a hard one to swallow. Phyllis Schlafly, oddly enough, Phyllis Schlafly is conservative Republican. She's married. I think she has like 6 kids. Oddly enough, she's a lawyer. She has a law degree, worked as a lawyer for a period of time, and then she'll do extensive writing. She'll have many, many books under her name. But it's just oddly enough, coming from such a professional background, that she would basically argue this. Anyway, we'll get back to Phyllis Schlafly down a little bit later. Consumerism. Okay, and kind of moving away from feminism, but talking about consumerism. In the 1960s, consumerism is still going to be big in the 1960s, was big in the 50s, was still going to be big in the 60s. Once again, women are definitely going to be at the forefront as consumers because they're basically the major purchasers for the family. So women are definitely still the major purchasers and consumers in society. Manufacturers try to anticipate the women's wants and needs, and definitely were creating things to make life easy and making things that definitely would appeal to women. Advertising will definitely launch campaigns encouraging and often telling women why they needed the things that they need. And so it's definitely goes into that whole consumerism time period. And it really works. I mean, that's definitely a part of the 1960s. Okay, now moving on to another issue. You're going to have, in a sense, on the issue of sex. In the 1960s, you're definitely going to have a sexual revolution take place. In 1960, you're going to have the coming of the pill, so another form of birth control. And that will definitely revolutionize sex and definitely revolutionize society, because now you can definitely pay attention and, in a sense, kind of create the family size that you want. And also, people will say that it's going to lead to free love and, once again, breakdown of the family. But it changes things. Obviously, you're going to see more couples living together. You're going to see more relationships that will go to another level before marriage. If you talk about the conservatives, they'll say, oh, it's all about free love and the breakdown of the family. The younger women who are a part of this will say, I can basically have control of my life at this point in time. And so when you have the coming of the pill, this is, it first comes out in 1960. By 1962, okay, you definitely have the pill, in a sense, widely used in American society, and that is going to be the end of the baby boomer time period. And will definitely change, in a sense, the makeup of society because of that. Okay, another thing that we have to talk about is going to be, it's a lot of things. It's not just one thing, but it becomes something bigger. You're definitely going to see the women's rights movement in this time period, and a push for the women's rights movement in this time period. But what's associated with that is going to be a book that is written. It's published in 1963, and the book is The Feminine Mystique. The Feminine Mystique is written by Betty Friedan. It's Friedan. Betty Friedan is a journalist. She ended up going to Smith College, and when she comes out of Smith College, she's going to basically do this research. And what she does is she's sending a flyer or questionnaire to fellow graduates of Smith College, and it's basically asking all these various questions, okay? And then they're sending her the results. So what she wanted to do was write this book, or a book, that comes out of this questionnaire, okay? And she honestly really didn't know what she was going to write about, and she definitely didn't know she was going to write about what she did. Now, before we move on, you have to remember that the people that are answering the questionnaire are college graduates, okay? So it's definitely, she's definitely looking at one segment of society, so definitely keep that in mind. But I think it also, it goes beyond that segment of society. Now, so she takes all this information, all this research that she gets, and she basically writes a book on her findings, okay? And what she found out, okay, is she will say that there's a problem with women, and this problem has no name. It's a strange stirring, a strange sense of dissatisfaction and a yearning for women. And that's exactly what I talked about in the last lecture when I talked about trouble in suburbia. Remember, they were frustrated and they really couldn't pinpoint what was wrong. They just weren't happy. They were frustrated. They were trapped. And this is exactly what Friedan is finding out, that there's a problem and it has really no name. And people and women just aren't happy. She'll say those that should be happy and fulfilled are not, and they feel guilty and ill at ease with this. So what she comes out of it, and in this book, The Feminine Mystique, okay, is she will say that women have to basically take control of their own lives and make themselves happy. They have to find things in their life and they have to find ways to make them happy. And so what she's saying is that if you like to cook or you like to bake, then do that. And maybe you should go work in a bakery. Maybe you should go work or open up a bakery. Maybe you just really like to read. So why don't you go work in a bookstore, or why don't you open up a bookstore? If you like science or kind of medicine and taking care of people, actually become a nurse. I mean, maybe you had already trained for it, but actually go and do it. And so she's really saying that women really need to kind of take that initiative and make things happen for themselves. And that is really going to kick off this feminism in the 1960s. And it's actually going to begin the wave of, or the push for the second wave of feminism in the United States. And she's basically saying women have to really take it upon themselves and do things that make themselves happy and not necessarily do what society says is best for the family, right? So if you're there and you're like, oh, well, I'm not going to go to work because I want to focus on the family, she's saying, well, you really should make yourself happy and figure out how to do it and have your family. And so that's really going to have this push for that second wave of feminism. And then really, if you talk about it, and then you look at pieces of legislation and you have like the affirmative action, which is going to come in 66, which will be after the feminine mystique. Women can use the feminine mystique and basically push to get into those, to go to college or to get into that PhD program or some graduate program to really do the things that they want to do, if that's the direction they want to go in. So you'll definitely see that. Okay, now, other groups of people that are definitely here in the 1960s that we definitely have to talk about is definitely different groups. And a lot of it will eventually come down into civil rights, because civil rights is definitely going to be a major issue for the 1960s, and women are going to be a part of the civil rights movement. Now, they might not always be decision makers within the civil rights movement, but they will be very active and will play very important roles within the civil rights movement. When you talk about the Hispanic community, you will definitely have a civil rights movement or a movement where they're really trying to stand up and have a say or get a say for their community. It will begin in the 1950s, I would say mid-1950s, but it's really going to be very strong and very present in the 60s. So my argument is that they would probably lay the groundwork in the 50s, and do a lot of work, and then it really takes off in the 60s. Plus, in the 60s, I don't know, it just seems that time of liberalism, and people are kind of listening in the 60s. The Hispanic community will definitely begin to develop a voice. They'll also start to develop a political voice. They will basically kind of realize that they kind of have to take ownership and basically make things happen for themselves. In the 1960s, you'll refer to it as the Hispanic Renaissance. You'll have a lot of writers and artists, Hispanic writers, artists, musicians, expressing their beliefs and expressing their culture. They'll discuss their lives and their problems. So 60s definitely known as the Hispanic Renaissance. Others will also choose to basically talk about civil rights, and really try to make things happen within their community. You have a woman by the name of Dolores Huerta. Dolores Huerta was a migrant worker, and she will be a part of that migrant worker movement. And so she will definitely try to organize Hispanics or the migrant worker. She will try to draw attention to the plight and the needs of the migrant worker. Dolores Huerta supported John F. Kennedy greatly. She was a part of what's known as the Community Service Organization that definitely helped Hispanics organize and also register them to vote and actually encourage them to vote. Huerta is going to work alongside Cesar Chavez to help organize farm workers. They're really working in conjunction with one another. Cesar Chavez tends to be the face of it. You tend to see Cesar Chavez on the TV. He tends to be doing the interviews and the speeches. Dolores Huerta does her own speeches. It's not that at all. But a lot of times Dolores Huerta will be in Sacramento and basically trying to talk to legislatures, trying to get Hispanics to vote, trying to enlighten legislatures, try to kind of push that legislative momentum, if you will. So it's not that she's not doing anything, because she's doing actually a lot. But she tends to be kind of doing other things, and Cesar Chavez tends to be that face that's kind of like always on the television screen, that type of thing. But Dolores Huerta will do a huge amount of organizing. She'll be involved in many of the very large strikes that will occur in California. So definitely major part of that Hispanic movement. She'll, as I said, lobbied California legislature for the farm labor movement. Now, moving away from the farm laborers movement, you have other movements within the Hispanic community. You'll have the rise of what's known as MAPA, M-A-P-A, the Mexican American Political Association, and this is where they tend to get more of a political voice. And MAPA is going to be one way of creating a foundation for a Hispanic political movement. And you got to create your foundation, and then from there you just go up and up. So the 60s are actually really important for the Hispanic community because they're laying that foundation for a political movement. You'll also have La Raza Unida Party, the United Mexican American Students Party, Mexican American Youth Organization. All these organizations are trying to support the Hispanic community. They're trying to raise awareness. They're trying to get the Hispanic community to be more politically active. All the ones that I had just mentioned, definitely trying to deal with housing, healthcare discrimination, or try to get access of housing and healthcare for the community. Also try to bring awareness about poor education, unemployment for that community. So 60s are really important for the Hispanic community because they lay that foundation. Are they going to be protesting and rioting in the 60s? No, not at all. It's not in a sense as, it's definitely not violent, and it's not as forceful, but that doesn't mean that it's not important. You have to lay that foundation for the rest of the for you to grow politically. And for the Hispanic community, that will definitely happen, and it definitely will happen in California, extensively in California. Over the years, you'll see more Hispanic elected officials. Definitely starts in the 60s. Okay, African American community, African American women. They will definitely be a large part of the civil rights movement and also speaking about their community. Okay, when you talk about the 1960s, or I'm going to call it like late 50s, early 60s, you're going to see a lot of writing coming from African American women, and definitely making a name for themselves. You're going to have a woman by the name of Lorraine Hansberry, Hansberry. Lorraine Hansberry is going to write what's known as A Raisin in the Sun. A Raisin in the Sun is 58-59, and it's a Broadway play, and it's about an African American family basically dealing with the white community because this African American family is going to move into basically a white community, and the white community is trying to prevent them from moving into the neighborhood. And that's what Raisin in the Sun is about. So they're really talking, this Broadway play was really talking about or echoing what's going on in society at this point in time. Another one is going to be Gwendolyn Brooks. This is 1950. Gwendolyn Brooks is going to write what's known as The Bean Eaters, okay? The Bean Eaters, and she is going to win a Pulitzer Prize for her The Bean Eaters. It is a collection of poems just talking about and celebrating the African American community. Within her poetry, okay, and this is in the 1950s, okay, she's going to use terms such as Black Power and Black Pride is heavily used in her works, okay. Black Power, Black Pride can mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people. Within her work, it's about pride and celebrating the African American community and that Black community. And it's about celebrating it. And what's interesting is that when you hear Black Power, Black Pride, you always think of like the Panthers, or you think about the riots and kind of activists in the 70s also. But I find it very interesting that a woman uses it actually kind of in the beginning. And so Black Power, Black Pride, it kind of depends on how it's used. It's how it's used in a text, but how it's also spoken about. But within Gwendolyn Brooks, it's about celebrating community and culture and life of the Black community. Okay, moving on into the 60s. This is where you already have the civil rights movement that's happening in the 50s, and you have protests and marches. Those are going to continue in the 60s. They're going to be peaceful in the beginning. I would say up to 65, they would be very peaceful. Under Martin Luther King Jr., would be very peaceful. Also, what you're going to start to see, they were used a little bit in the 50s, but definitely used extensively in the 60s, is what's known as sit-ins. And sit-ins is when you go to a restaurant and you demand, or an African American would go into a restaurant and you demand to be served, which the restaurants won't do. So you just sit there until you get served, which you're not going to. But the idea is that if you sit there, then they can't bring other customers in, and basically they're not going to make any money. And it's a way of protesting. And so one of the big ones is going to be 1960. It's in Greensboro, North Carolina. Woolworths was a department store that had a lunch counter, and they'll do a sit-in at Woolworths lunch counter demanding to be served. They won't after X amount of hours. Then they'll basically have these people arrested for trespassing. And, you know, there's photographers and news cameras everywhere, and they're taking the pictures. And even though they didn't get served, they basically are getting what they want because they're getting media attention for it. And so that's one of the popular ones. There's sit-ins all over the country. And then also in the 60s, you'll have what's known as freedom rides. African-American protesters, or just African-American civil rights, will basically ride transportation, public transportation, trying to show segregation. And if they get arrested, then they have to have their day in court, and then they can argue that segregation on public transportation. When you talk about freedom rides, freedom summers, freedom rides, they usually did in summer, it can be kind of risky because when you go on down to the South, a lot of police departments will actually not protect them. A lot of police departments would actually go after them just as well as the citizens were. And so people who did freedom rides always had like phone numbers of federal authorities. So if they ran into problems or they got arrested, they would automatically call federal authorities in. And it was also a way of kind of getting the federal officials involved in this. But when it's just a way to protest civil rights, a way to show the problems within the civil rights issues. Okay, African American women in the 1960s. They definitely are going to, as I said, they're going to participate in the civil rights. They did the freedom rides. They were involved in sit-ins. They did marches. They were there at, the protests and the speeches. They will join organizations such as the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, the SCLC, which is the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. Also, what's referred to as SNCC, SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. The Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And so women are going to be a part of it. Okay, they are not going to be like the decision makers. They're not going to be the leaders of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, but they will be active members. Okay, now we're going to move away from the civil rights or certain communities and just move into overall issues, okay? Courtship, marriage, divorce, okay? When you talk about 1960s, okay, more couples lived together. But also it's interesting because that's another thing people will say, well, then, people won't get married because they'll just live together. But what's also interesting that more couples live together, but also marriages will actually increase. Marriage rates actually increase in the 60s. So they tend to live together and then get married. Birth rates will decline. Birth rates will decline by 1964. And that's obviously due to the pill. You will have a court case, 1965, Griswold versus Connecticut. Griswold versus Connecticut will deal with the arrest of a Planned Parenthood official for defying Connecticut's law that banned birth control and distribution of information. Okay, so I'm going to read it again. Griswold versus Connecticut, 1965. It dealt with the arrest of a Planned Parenthood official for defying Connecticut's laws that banned birth control and distribution of information. The ruling stated that the law was unconstitutional and citizens had the right to privacy in the matters of marital intimacy. So Connecticut lost and Griswold won, and it basically was definitely a positive thing for those that are trying to deal with the birth control issues. Okay, divorce will also increase. Marriages increase, but also divorces will increase. Okay, another thing, when you talk about the younger generation, okay, the younger generation, college students, and I would say mid to late teens and definitely into the 20s, okay, when I talk about this younger generation. This is a younger generation that was really questioning society because we're in the 60s. We're basically in Vietnam at this point in time. And the younger generation is it's questioning about society. They'll say that the United States government and United States or American culture or American society is hypocritical. It says one thing, but then it does something else. It says that it wants peace, but it makes weapons of mass destruction. And then they also really question about what does war do besides kill people, and really what has come out of war. And so they're really questioning war just as an entity, and they will say they don't agree with it. They don't agree with war. They don't agree with just killing people. And so you have this younger generation that is really questioning society. This younger generation is going to be what's known as counterculture, and I have a slide on that. Counterculture really is questioning what's going on in society. It's questioning what's going on in the government. And they're really breaking away from established society. They're breaking away with authority. They're breaking away from mom and dad. They're breaking away from the government. And they're basically saying, we don't agree with American society, and we'll just figure out where we fit in. We'll create our own society, and we'll just figure it out on our own. Okay? You have some people within this younger generation that tend to be more political, and they'll have the Students for a Democratic Society. They will try to have a political voice, okay? And they'll be protesting Vietnam, they'll be protesting war, weapons, that type of thing. Then you also have another segment of this counterculture, this younger generation, that it's not that they disagree with that stuff, they completely agree with it, they just aren't the protesting type. They just aren't going to have, they just don't know if they have to have that political voice, okay? So it's basically kind of how different people kind of want to express themselves, okay? But within this counterculture, you're also going to have what's known as the hippies. And this is the hippies of the 60s. The hippies of the 60s are, once again, they're breaking with established society. They're breaking with the norms. They're definitely breaking with authority, okay? And they're going to live life on their own terms. And living life on their own terms, meaning that they're not going to dress and act like mom and dad. They're going to wear jeans. They're going to wear t-shirts. They're going to wear tie-dyed shirts, you know, where you take a shirt and you put all these different colors in it and you tie it in knots and you come out with this really crazy, funky collage of colors, and there's no pattern, but that's almost what the counterculture is about. It's just like make it up as we go. Tie-dye clothing, long hair. Everybody grew their hair long. Men and women grew their hair long. Shoes are optional at this point in time. There was a lot of drug use at this point in time because they'll say, well, mom and dad don't want you to do it. And they'll kind of find it out. They're there to discover what's out there, and they'll kind of pick and choose what they like. Rock and roll music is also a big part of that hippie generation. Rock and roll was a lot of different things in the 60s. It spoke about anti-war, it spoke about love, it spoke about kind of love your fellow man, it spoke against going against authority. It could just be flat out like love song, right? Rock and roll was a lot of other things. It could be kind of folk music, and it could be, I can't think of a person right off the bat. I can see her, but I can't think of her right now. It can be real folks music, but then it can go to like acid rock. And so kind of almost anything is under the sun kind of goes under rock and roll. But you have something that's more like Janis Joplin, harder like Janis Joplin. Then you have like Joan Baez, which would be a little not as hard. But you got acid rock, and you got everything kind of under the sun. Mom and dad, your older generation, doesn't understand rock and roll music, and that also plays into it because they're kind of defying mom and dad for it. But the younger generation understood rock and roll, and it almost kind of spoke to them and spoke for them in this time period, and was a major part of that younger generation. Okay? You'll also see them doing a lot of protests. They'll protest the Vietnam. They'll protest civil rights. They'll walk with Cesar Chavez. They will be a part of the Freedom Summers, the Freedom Rides, Freedom Summers. They'll protest the Vietnam War, as I mentioned that. They'll protest war in general. And so you will definitely see a lot of college students protesting in this time period. Okay, now I had mentioned this a while ago, a few lectures ago, like 1920s, I guess, 1920s, I think it was. I talked about Cosmopolitan magazine. Cosmopolitan magazine was basically a magazine for women, and it talked about a lot of things. It talked about healthcare, or, you know, like information about health, how to run a nice household, maybe some beauty items, how to take care of the kids, aviation. In 1960s, Cosmo is going to radically change. And what they're trying to do is they're trying to capture this younger generation that doesn't want to be like mom and dad. And this younger, rebellious generation, this hippie generation. So they move away from their old standpoint. And now Cosmo is all about women and fashion and women and kind of pushing the boundaries. They talk about birth control a lot. They talk about relationships, a lot of hair and beauty, and the latest clothing scene that's out there, like rock and roll music. They would talk about this is where Cosmo radically changes. It's also about consumerism because all the advertisers have to sell all the things that they want, and so it's radically going to change, and it's really addressing the younger generation. And in the 60s, it's addressing a younger generation that's very rebellious, okay? And from here on out, that will be what Cosmopolitan magazine is about. It's about the younger generation. It's about kind of like a sexual revolution, a latest fashion, the latest hair, relationships, that type of thing, okay? Now, having said all those things, okay, and this younger generation and women pushing the boundaries, especially with feminism, there's also going to still be other like versions of women. I mean, we know that there's everything under the sun, okay? But you still got to remember you've got Marilyn Monroe. Marilyn Monroe was big in the 60s. She was kind of that sex kitten. And I wouldn't say definitely like a hippie type of thing. She was like definitely more old school, and definitely kind of that sex kitten kind of look. And I don't, it's hard to, I'm talking about it and I'm putting labels on it, but Marilyn Monroe was blonde. And I think some of her movies kind of put her as a dumb blonde, or kind of that airheaded blonde. She definitely wasn't that, but those were kind of roles that she kind of ended up playing. But there was that, my whole point is there was that portrayal of women, okay? And it was very popular, okay? But then you also have other women in the 60s, like Katharine Hepburn. Katharine Hepburn was an extremely strong, intelligent woman, and she played extremely strong, intelligent women in her movies. So there's still like kind of everything under the sun that is being portrayed about women. And so once again, you kind of put labels on them, but then another thing, there's a lot of other things going on, and it's showing all the various things going on in society. Okay, and that is where I'm going to stop this lecture. I am going to pick up another aspect of the 60s in another lecture.